Thanks for tuning in. I'm Scott Walter.
And I'm Michael Watson.
In this episode, Elon Musk, the founder of Tesla and SpaceX, faces scrutiny from his fellow liberals as he attacks the press. This is the Influence Watch podcast. Elon Musk, the businessman behind electric car manufacturer Tesla Motors, spaceflight venture SpaceX, and environmentalist energy company turned Tesla subsidiary SolarCity, has enjoyed all kinds of positive press from the mainstream media over the past several years. Joining a cool techie vision with environmentalist bona fides, Musk is a major cultural player and the darling of the press until last week, when he lashed out at mainstream media coverage that recently turned hostile. Despite enjoying a $7,500 per car federal tax credit subsidy, and that doesn't include state-level subsidies, Tesla Motors is in financial difficulties. Making matters trickier for Musk, the United Auto Workers labor union is trying to unionize a Tesla manufacturing plant in California and running a media campaign alleging improper labor practices at the plant, a typical union organizing tactic. Even as Consumer Reports, a magazine partly funded by left-wing and environmentalist foundations, declared that it can't recommend Tesla's Model 3 until Musk promised an upgrade to the car's brakes. All this provoked Musk to lash out at the press, and his attack turned the left-leaning mainstream media against their one-time visionary. But all this raises a question. What should you think of Musk if you started out skeptical of a government-subsidized transportation toy for the affluent? Well, Mike, let's start by just unpacking all the layers of green subsidies and corporate welfare that Musk is getting.
Yeah, Musk and Tesla especially. SpaceX receives government funding, but it tends to be the government pays Musk to perform a service, pays SpaceX to perform a service. The military pays to put a satellite in space. NASA pays to put a telescope in space. The government is getting something for its expenditure on that sort of stuff. For Tesla, there has been a lot of just straightforward, here's some money. The LA Times tried to unpack it back in 2015. They estimated it was just under $5 billion to that point.
Yeah, that's billion with a B.
Yes, $5 billion. That number has probably increased, given that estimate is now 2.5 years old.
And yet, the company has troubles.
And yet, the company remains in some financial difficulties. Now, a lot of those subsidies take the form of tax credits to buyers of Tesla's vehicles, because Tesla's vehicles produce no point source emissions. We'll get to that massive qualifier in a little bit. The government says, great, here's $7,500. The federal government says, here's $7,500 off your taxes to buy one. Now, from an economic perspective, that is no different than if the government simply wrote a $7,500 check to the buyer of an electric car. If anything, it's a little more insidious because it's easier to see when the government mails you a check, when the government is mailing people checks or is explicitly providing someone a cash subsidy, as opposed to, oh, you just take a write-off of your taxes. That was your money to begin with. But functionally, you're still using government money or government deferring money to get a member of the general public to do exactly what the government wants it to do, in this case, to buy an electric car.
Yes, those taxes that you're saving will be made up for by someone who probably earns significantly less than the average Tesla buyer, like Leonardo DiCaprio.
Right. The Tesla Model S base price, I was looking it up the other day, is $60,000 after the $7,500 off. So you're talking a mid-level. You can get a decent AMG Mercedes for that price. And when you get up into the higher range, I think the P1000, the top of the range model with the maximum performance and the maximum range battery, you're up into the hundreds. You're up into 911 turbos and things that car enthusiasts get excited about.
Yeah, something that you can be very proud of when you hit that Santa Monica Shishi restaurant.
Very,
and
very
the
much.
valet parks it for you.
And the valet parks it for you.
Yeah, my son in high school hopes to earn enough to buy his first car, and it will be significantly less than the subsidy on the Tesla.
In all probability, yes. And that $7,500 tax subsidy is only the beginning of the subsidies that various levels of government have given Tesla. In 2009, they received a taxpayer loan. They were floated a loan by the Obama administration on something in the order of $465 million, million with an M. When Tesla built a factory in Nevada, the state offered them subsidies and tax abatements and other corporate welfare benefits that the LA Times estimated at $1.3 billion just for one factory.
From one state.
From one state. And to get an idea of how much that $7,500 subsidy to the buyers accumulates just through 2015, again, the LA Times estimated that Tesla buyers collected $284 million in just that one subsidy, not including the Nevada tax abatements and other state tax subsidies for the buyers of Tesla products.
California has a way to slide money to Tesla too, correct?
A couple. The state of California has very strict air quality rules for cars. In part, that's because of the geography around Los Angeles, where the mountains basically cut it off from the sea, and so all the back in the 60s when cars all got 5 miles to the gallon and leaded fuel and no catalytic converters, so all the nasty stuff came out the back, and that's where Los Angeles' infamous smog comes from. California responds by putting on its own air quality rules. It was grandfathered into the original EPA rules on car tailpipe emissions. California still gets to set its own rules because they had set rules beforehand. So now, as those rules have evolved, California now has a program, a sort of one of those cap and tax programs where California says there have to be a certain number of electric cars on the road, and automakers who don't produce a certain number of electric cars have to buy and sell tradable these tradable credits to make the correct number of electric cars. Tesla makes only electric cars, so they collect a lot of credits that they can then go ahead and sell to among Honda. Right, now they just introduced one, but in past years, Honda had not made a plug-in electric vehicle. So Honda would have to go to Tesla or would have to go to somebody else who was making a large number of electric cars and buy them to continue selling cars in California.
Yeah, and these subsidies are so valuable to the company's business that they even include them in their advertising, don't they?
Yeah, when you go to Tesla's website and when you go to these high-end car websites, you can, in fact, even low-end car websites, you can, build your car, put in a bunch of options and see, oh, okay, how much, you tell me the base price, how much for the nice one? Well, in the fine print on Teslas, and they always quote your price. They always quote you an MSRP. In the fine print on the one you get on the Tesla website, it tells you that the list price is, quote, after estimated savings. And of course, the most prominent of these estimated savings is the federal tax credit. Because if, again, they would rather sell you the same car at $60,000 than at $67,500. You can start tacking on options to your AMG Mercedes at $67,500 that, 60, oh, okay, well, makes it look like a more competitive product, despite all the problems.
And Tesla Motors is not the only Elon Musk company that gets all this nice taxpayer gravy.
No, until very recently, tax credits were scheduled to expire in 2017. The Solar City, which does household solar panel installations, there was a substantial tax write-off if you installed it. Now, the individual tax write-off was scheduled to expire in 2017. The business tax write-off shrank for installing these products. Now, again, Musk sometimes will say publicly that he wants these subsidies to be phased out, that they don't actually help his company. That kind of conflicts with his lobbying record.
Yes, it's not small either, is it?
You're into the, I believe in 2017 or 2016 they were in the six figures. They were retaining very high-powered lobbying firms up until 2017. The Podesta Group, which we discussed in our episode about the Center for American Progress, very closely aligned with the Clinton family and with people who were very closely allied with the Clintons. The Podesta Group was one of the firms which Tesla retained. In 2017, after something happened, the Podesta Group were no longer retained by Tesla. And we'll get into that discussion later. But certainly they have lobbied heavily on subsidy policy, on mandates, on general environmentalist policy that would advance the ability of Tesla to have essentially an unfair advantage in car sales. And again, this has continued at least as late as 2017.
So you're telling me that the motivation would not appear to be simply saving the planet?
Certainly, Musk stands to make a great deal of money if the planet is saved by adopting electric cars.
Got you. Well, at least electric cars means that there's no connection. If I somehow found the money to buy one of these lovely vehicles for myself, at least I would be saving the planet because my car would have no connection whatsoever to any sort of fossil fuel, right?
No. All the Tesla charging stations, or most people, charge them in their garages. You're drawing from the national grid. The national grid is 60% or so supplied by traditional combustion energy sources. Now, so that's only 60% is supplied by traditional combustion energy sources. Of course, 20% of the next block of 20% is nuclear energy, which I tend to think is really cool, but environmentalists tend not to. And then much of the remaining 20% comes from hydroelectricity, which also I think is really cool, but environmentalists tend not to.
Yes. Well, subsidy troubles and financial troubles are not the only issues causing Musk to lose sleep these days. We mentioned in the setup a bit that he is starting to have union trouble too. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of reporting over the last couple months that Tesla allegedly has lousy labor practices, that they weren't following the occupational safety rules. That, of course, coincides not at all coincidentally, I'm sure, with the fact that the United Auto Workers is attempting to organize Tesla's factory in California. When the factory used to be unionized when it was controlled by a GM-Toyota joint venture. GM-Toyota weren't making money on the plant. They move out, lies vacant. Tesla moves in. It's now a new business, a new shop, no union. So the UAW wants to reestablish itself at the plant, and they have started what is known to us labor nerds as a corporate campaign.
What is a corporate campaign?
Yes, they have a number of methods to make life difficult for a brand, to damage and tarnish the brand, by making allegations about unfair labor practices, by using lobbying to either condition favorable government policy on union work standards, which the UAW has done in California, by filing often frivolous National Labor Relations Board complaints regarding working conditions, by public demonstrations, by media outreach on the union's allegations. So how this has gone is going down at Tesla in California. The UAW pushed a bill that would condition all those nice taxpayer subsidies for buying electric cars on the labor practices at the manufacturing plants.
Hitting him in the subsidies. That's a really low blow.
Hitting Mr. Musk where it hurts. They've also, filed labor board charges alleging unfair labor practices, alleging illegal hostility to the union organizing, and they've made substantial. There were some big pieces written about labor practices at Tesla, alleging that they were well beneath the industry standard. Now, Tesla denies this. They have some evidence to back themselves up. And again, I don't trust a union. I don't. When a union is trying to organize a plant, I don't trust the union to tell me what the working conditions are at the plant. And that is what's going on.
And the unions have, just as Mr. Musk invests heavily in lobbying, the unions have invested heavily in this campaign.
Fox Business estimated that when you can look at the unions have to make these federal disclosures every year that say what they spent on everything. And from that, you can analyze and estimate how much they're spending on trying to organize a particular facility, especially with the auto workers, because the facilities they're trying to organize are very, very large, and they tend not to be in downtown New York City or downtown Washington, D.C. So the UAW tried to organize a Nissan plant in Canton, Mississippi. Sorry. So anything that, all expenditures that are, within 20 miles of Canton, Mississippi, probably are related to that campaign. So Fox Business did an estimate reported that there was an estimate from the UAW's Labor Department filings that suggests that the union spent something on the order of $400,000 trying to organize Tesla.
Not cheap. Now, another aspect of corporate campaigns is they almost always will include that, of course, that the working conditions are terrible, and therefore the workers need to be protected by the selfless union bosses. But there often is also claims about the quality of whatever the product, the good or service being done. Has that arisen in some of the Tesla effort?
Sort of. Consumer Reports magazine, which is a left-wing aligned, not directly union funded, but left-wing aligned. Board members have associations with some actually very left-wing organizations, some of which take a substantial amount of union money. Does car reviews, and a lot of people really trust those car reviews. And their initial review of the Tesla Model 3, their kind of standard sedan vehicle, is generally considered by analysts to be the car that will sink or swim the company. If they hit their targets on sales and their targets on production for the Model 3, they can make it.
If this is the lower rent version,
this
right?
is
not the Leonardo DiCaprio.
This is not the $60,000 base Model S. This is they say they want to get it down to $35,000. After, again, all prices are after you, the taxpayer, paid $7,500 to whoever bought it. They want to get it down to $35,000. It's not there yet. But so Consumer Reports tested it. Again, apparently it's braking underperformed, which one might expect when you pack a heavy amount of not lead acid, when you pack a heavy battery pack in a vehicle. It's heavier than it looks. But apparently the brakes underperformed. Consumer Reports gave it a negative recommendation. Don't buy one. Now, later, as we were preparing for this podcast yesterday, Consumer Reports revised and now gave it a recommend because Musk promised a universal upgrade to the software, apparently, that makes it work, that makes its performance satisfactory. So Consumer Reports is on, they're conflicted on both ends because they take a substantial amount of money from environmentalist foundations. They get money from California Endowment. They get money from the Pew Charitable Trusts. They get money from the Energy Foundation, which is the big anti-natural gas funding source.
That itself takes the money from Hewlett and Packard and Pew and
Right, from all the big, that it's a funding vehicle for bigger environmentalist foundations. So, I would not accuse them of revising it to satisfy their donors, but the potential that Consumer Reports, wouldn't want to hit somebody with environmentalist bona fides too hard, is always a possibility. And then, of course, it also has conflicting ties to more distant conflicting ties to labor, as this UAW corporate campaign is ongoing. So, that just kind of shows you how this influence can work in a media capacity, even with ostensibly nonprofit media that takes no corporate funding, so that it tries to remain as neutral as possible. Well, it's taking ideological funding, it's taking interest group funding, its board is stacked with people who are tied to all sorts of other entities. There is no such thing as no conflicting interests.
Yep. Well, you mentioned media, and of course, the next thing we should talk about a bit is Mr. Musk, who had been a media darling, is not having such happy relations with the press lately.
Yeah, now he's fighting them. In part because he's now getting hostile coverage, in part because of the UAW corporate campaign, in part because of the initial negative review from Consumer Reports, in part because the financial performance of Tesla has not been what Musk has promised. He last week went on a pretty substantial Twitter tirade against the media as an industry. He at one point said, I should create a website that tracks journalists' credibility. We can call it Pravda, after the Soviet propaganda newspaper. Now, whatever you think of the press, this is an interesting heel turn from Mr. Musk, as the press has turned on him.
Yeah. Well, let's switch to his broader influence network. And as always, we want to remind folks that influencewatch.org has extensive material about the entities that we're talking about. There's an Elon Musk entry, there's a Musk Foundation entry and whatnot, where you can go for more information. But sketch out for us a bit the Musk Influence Network.
So the Musk Influence Network is actually a good way to think about all sort of corporate influence networks, just kind of in a smaller version. The left likes to say, well, corporate interests spend so much money lobbying and so much money on political candidates, and yes, they do. But how they do it is very different from single-issue ideological entities and labor unions. Single-issue ideological entities, Planned Parenthood, the NRA, tend to be, 90+ one side or the other, because one side represents their issue in the way that they favor. Labor unions, similar. 95 to the left.
97, 98, 99, and 100.
In some cases, 97, 98, 99, 100. Business, 60-40, 70-30, 50-50. And the reason that you do that is to ingratiate yourself, regardless of who wins or loses, to have a seat at the table no matter which way things go. So Musk actually, according to followthemoney.org, which tracks state, federal, and some limited local giving, is pretty close to 50-50 in his political candidate and committee giving. Now, given the opportunity to make a straightforward contribution that would serve his financial interests, he gave money to a California ballot measure campaign in 2006 that would put a requirement for so-called renewable energy, which includes solar, Solar City. And again, in the case of Musk, this attempts to ingratiate himself to, regardless of who won, His foundation was a donor to the Clinton Foundation, but then after President Donald Trump was elected, he sat on a couple of the initial business advisory councils until Trump made a decision that probably could theoretically hurt Tesla Solar City's business by withdrawing from the Paris Climate Treaty.
Which is to say, lessening the pressure on
and how that would operate is because theoretically the Paris Climate Treaty could evolve into a binding cap on carbon dioxide emissions. That would make conventional motor vehicles, would have to either be taxed or, again, the French have said by 2040 they are not going to permit gasoline-powered cars. Now, we'll see whether that actually happens.
Yes, I'll take that bet.
But, theoretically, they could even be regulated out of existence, which would benefit Tesla as a manufacturer of premium non-petrol cars.
Yep. Now, he also has his own foundation with around $50 million or so in assets, I believe, at most recent count. And that too helps his business interests, doesn't it?
Yes. The Musk Foundation makes contributions to environmentalist groups. The Sierra Club Foundation, the 501c3 education arm of the 501c4 lobbying and advocacy Sierra Club. The Natural Resources Defense Council, where DiCaprio's on the board of that, right?
I think that's right.
The Tesla owner on the board of the environmentalist group, partly funded by the foundation run by the Tesla guy, and then the Tide Center, which is a liberal nonprofit sponsor of other nonprofits that do, among other things, environmentalist stuff. So by supporting all these advocacy groups, they then pressure state governments, the federal government, to advocate for policies like subsidies for electric cars, like subsidies for solar energy that benefit Musk's business.
Yep. And you mentioned earlier that he has given significantly to some Democrat lobbying firms like the Podesta Group, but he also has tried hard, and this is a part of a much broader trend of environmentalist interests trying to sway Republicans, because if you can peel some Republicans away from
right. I mean, this is how business influence operates. Sometimes at the federal level, in recent years, sometimes the Republicans win and sometimes the Democrats win. And if you're all in on one side or the other, if the other side wins, then you get hurt. So, and again, this comes out after the 2016 election. The Republicans have won. The Republicans are considering a substantial rethink of the American tax code, which, when a substantial part of your business is subsidized by tax code subsidies, that's a lever that you want to make sure doesn't get pulled. And so, how do you ingratiate yourself with Republican members of Congress? Well, you hire a lobbying firm that is aligned with the Republican Party. Lobbying firms, some of them, have former staffers from both parties. They're, are bipartisan lobbying firms. But then you also have partisan lobbying firms that pretty much pull from one side or the other. Podesta Group on the Democratic side, before it folded, was a good example of this. And so, okay, well, the Republicans are in charge now. We need them to trust us. So fire the Podesta Group and bring on a Republican-aligned lobbying firm that hopefully the Republican members of Congress who used to employ these Republican lobbyists will listen to.
So it sounds like one of the lessons for the week is when people are appealing to you, to your idealistic side, that, come on, man, we got to save the planet, you may actually discover that you're really serving big business interests rather than purely idealistic planet saving.
It doesn't matter what, again, we're using an environmentalist here because he's in the news, but it doesn't regardless of what high-minded ideal is being brought to you as a policymaker, as a voter, if you need to look behind it, because there is an interest. There is an interest. That interest may be, a single issue advocacy group that cares only about this one thing and doesn't care about any potential trade-offs, doesn't care about any other interests in competition. It may be a corporate interest, like, say, Elon Musk, which is looking for government favor. It could be a labor union, which is trying to organize itself and get more, and get more members and get more dues revenue and get more compelled agency fees in states like California. There rarely are motives that are pure. Yeah, and that's the way it's always been since since Andrew Jackson tried to break the Bank of the United States.
Yes, well, or Samuel Johnson 2 centuries ago said all motives are mixed. So
all motives are mixed. That's
one lesson is don't let folks manipulate you too easily with beautiful, perfect sounding idealistic talk, because probably there are corporate interests on both sides of any issue.
Even if those interests are ostensibly a nonprofit, they may be supported by a further up the line corporate interest, or they may be funded by some single issue ideologue who has some overwhelming desire to do something because that's what he believes is right.
Yep. But there's probably another lesson in the fascinating messiness of the Elon Musk situation, and that is that your enemies may or may not be your friends.
Right. Other people this week, who many people in the case of Roseanne Barr on the right thought, oh, this is my adversary's adversary, or more my friend's friend. Well, lo and behold, do you really want to tie yourself to a 9/11 conspiracy theorist who has had pictures taken of herself in a Nazi uniform putting gingerbread cookies in an oven, when she then comes out and says something horribly racist about Valerie Jarrett, whatever you think of her? Maybe you shouldn't have tied yourself up with that. So now here comes along Musk, who, making some very Trumpish noises, goes hard after the press. Well, he's still who he always was. He's still the subsidy farmer out in California, with generally social liberal views, with generally heavily environmentalist views. Now, does that mean that we need to trust all the attacks on him? Well, again, all the labor stuff, his labor practices stuff is probably being mostly driven by the United Auto Workers, who have a vested interest.
And are not known for their precise accuracy.
Yes, the manufacturing unions are not known for their probity typically. And again, their interest is to do brand damage until Musk says, okay, fine, I'm not going to continue advocating to my employees not to unionize, which he has done publicly. And then, Consumer Reports comes out and gives the Tesla 3 initially a negative review, then semi-withdraws, or declares the core fault in the negative review to have been satisfied, therefore giving it a positive recommendation. They're all sorts of conflicted. They have environmentalist funders who may wish to see Tesla and the electric car as a concept advanced further than maybe it necessarily deserves to be at this point in its development cycle. And again, they've taken money from the Ford Foundation, which has ties to both environmentalists and labor, both sides of this mess. Pew Charitable Trusts, who are pretty environmentalists, and then we mentioned the California Endowment and the Energy Foundation, which are both fairly strongly environmentalist.
There sounds like there is no substitute for being very sober.
There is
and
no
parsing all of the different.
There is no substitute for giving everything a close and skeptical reading, and taking stock of the conflicting interests.
Yep. Well, as always, you can learn more about those interests at influencewatch.org. That is our show for this week. If you're listening to this on iTunes or Stitcher, you should know that we broadcast a live video version at 10 a.m. on Thursdays on Facebook Live and YouTube. You can find our pages by searching Capital Research Center. And if you're watching the video version, we encourage you to subscribe to the audio on your preferred podcast platform. We'll see you next week.